he threw a $20 bill at me and he's like, hey, go buy me cigarettes. And I was sitting there and I'm just like, huh. And I think, another part of feeling stuck is just people putting just too much pressure on themselves. Hi, my name is Keenan Lynch. I'm a cinematographer based in Toronto. I've been doing this for about a decade now. Started off mostly first ACing and gaffing, and then slowly transitioned into mainly shooting and then only shooting. When the pandemic first started, work came to a standstill, and I was like, I was getting older at the time, and I'm like, started thinking like, is this like a realistic goal for myself? Like, am I gonna be able to become a cinematographer? And, I thought about it and I'm like, this is kind of like my last shot to make something of this. And it really wasn't, but, I find sometimes people put a lot of pressure of where they're at certain times and seeing their peers. It's hard not to make comparisons to other people. But at that time, I was like, I'm gonna go all in this and really try. And when production started opening up again, some terrible things happened, and the catalyst of it was kind of like the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And I think people started to realize just some of, the lack of representation in media and film. So a friend of mine, Gail Yee, someone I went to school with, made a list of black cinematographers. And I really appreciated that because I think the hard thing is sometimes you just need a lens or people to see your work, and I felt like that was a great opportunity. And unfortunately the circumstances of why that was made and why that happened isn't the best, but I do appreciate that someone made a list kind of highlighting the talent of black cinematographers in the country. And from that list, just a lot of people had their eyes on my work, and I kind of built up my name as a gaffer, and built relationships with people. So within a short amount of time, a lot of music videos kind of came up, and I think I shot like 4 or 5 music videos within like a month and a half. And just getting those reps in of lots of projects with different looks and different styles with bigger budgets was just like the big catalyst that kind of moved my career forward to kind of where it is today, where that was the first time where I was like, I'm a cinematographer, and I stopped gaffing and I stopped camera assisting. I think it's hard sometimes for, not to be too hard on yourself, and just definitely like the sense of imposter syndrome, especially at different points. And I remember when I first started getting into commercials, it was like a new world to me, and it was something, I didn't have a ton of experience, but, I was learning and I was enjoying it. And, there's kind of different crews that work in commercial narrative. So I was being exposed to a new set of crew, and, and I remember like one incident where I was working on a commercial, and, it was lunchtime, and I was just eating my lunch sitting in an apple box. And I remember the package truck driver came over to me, and he threw a $20 bill at me, and he's like, hey, go buy me cigarettes. And I was sitting there and I'm just like, huh. I'm like, oh, why would I buy you cigarettes? And he's like, you're a PA, aren't you? And I'm like, no, I'm actually the cinematographer on this shoot. And he kind of paused for a second, and he went, oh, and he's like, oh, sorry about that. And then kind of walked away. I remember sitting there, I'm just like, I've kind of had this idea, I've been fighting or working hard to kind of get to a certain point, and just, someone sees me and just kind of makes his judgment, I'm a black person on set. They just assume that, I'm a production assistant. And there's nothing wrong with being a production assistant, but, it's just, for him just to come up and just not know who I am and just kind of have that, it kind of got to me. And the wild thing about that set was that same day we had a black talent in the commercial. I remember he was in his mid to late 30s, and he kind of comes up to me. He's like, hey, I've been doing this for a long time, and I've never worked with a black cinematographer before. And he's like, so I appreciate you being here. And it was this weird thing where it's I'm like, wow, this is a nice thing to hear from someone who's looks like me. And then at the same time, I have this guy, completely bring me down. So it's there are moments where, there's self-doubt, and, I think it's important to remember that like you're there for a reason, and and you got to see yourself, like I'm supposed to be here. And it's easy not to sometimes, but it's definitely something that is important to me, and just especially trying to bring out people who again, like it's all about opportunity, and I always try to make sure that if I can, I'm trying to also help people out who come from a similar situation for me, or that like look like me. I think feeling stuck's a pretty natural feeling to have, as a cinematographer. I think sometimes people are really hard on what their expectations are of their career, and they're always wanting to improve or get a certain type of project, and keep working in a way that's the progression of their career. But I think the hard thing is people can't see where they've come from, in the sense like it's hard to see what you've done when you're in it at that moment. But for perspective, if you look at your career now from the lens of you a few years ago, you'd be like, wow, you're doing so great, you're really happy with the types of projects. But I think sometimes it's hard to see where you're at when you're in it. And I think another part of feeling stuck is just people putting just too much pressure on themselves. When I was younger, I used to feel like cinematography was like almost like a competition. And I think it's just the way, like if you went to film school, just the way the school setting is, it's based on grades. So it's like you're getting graded on your work. So it's like, oh, this person's work's better than this person, and your work's being compared by your peers. So it's like, it's a natural feeling to have, but it's funny because it's the opposite of what it is, It's like, it's again, anything with art or cinematography is subjective to the viewer and the story you're telling. So there is no best, you know what I mean? There's just different people telling different stories, and you can have an amazing cinematographer, but they might not be right for the right project. And that's like a big thing where it's hard to see that sometimes. And I think for younger cinematographers, there is a sense of competition, but the further I've gone in my career, it's like, when I see one of my peers doing an amazing project, I'm like, wow, great job. Like, how did you do that? And you just like communicate. But when you're younger, I think because there is that hunger, there's like this school-esque competition. And I think it's something that young cinematographers should try to get out of their head, because, in this day and age with mediums changing, there's more cinematography work than ever. My work is like one of my biggest passion, which is like creating images. And there's times when I'm working on projects and it's 12-hour days. I don't see my family, I don't see my partner, and like my crew and my collaborators I'm working with kind of become like a family. And it takes a lot out of you, to kind of create on certain levels. And I think it's important, like, to know that that's not the only important thing in your life. And I always try to find a balance, like, knowing, like, that, I'm super grateful that I'm able to do this job, but it's not the only important thing in my life. And I think having that balance, when you're not working and you have time off, it's a lot easier to, like, transition and deal with those slower times. And the thing about this job is there does come a day when you're going to stop working. Some people have long careers, 30, 40-year careers. Some people have shorter careers. And, I think it's such a privilege to do what we do, and I appreciate it. But, I do understand that it's going to end one day, and I need to make sure that the other aspects of my life are, like, something I also cherish. I think sometimes, like, the only advice I'd have is, like, don't be so hard on yourself. I feel like specifically with younger cinematographers, they're really judging the work they do. And like, again, like, I think no matter what level you're at, you'll always have a project or a certain scene that you wish you could have, done the extra 10 or 20%. But, most of the time you're going to be looking at that, way harder than anyone else would be looking at that same thing. It's just, sometimes people are putting like just more pressure on themselves, and it comes to like even like how you're leveling up or how you're exceeding in your career. It's like comparing yourself to other people. It's just like, give yourself credit for what you're doing and what you're able to do. I think a big part of what people expect now is just like you have to you can't, react in a certain way. You have to present yourself. You have to be a good person because, everyone knows each other through 1 or 2 degrees of separation. And, if you act a certain way and kind of continue bad behavior, doesn't matter how much talent you have, there's going to be a point where people aren't going to want to work with you anymore. And I've seen it happen, and it's just something that people aren't willing to put up with, and 100% so. We're putting so much of our lives into what we do. The last thing we want is someone who's going to treat you or disrespect you. And that's why I always try to project and be as nice as I can and understand where people are at different points, just because I know they're away from their families, they're away from their lives, and and there does come a point where it's you just got to let people know that you appreciate what they're doing. I think one of the most important things people need to understand is just how important communication is. And, as a cinematographer, your main job is to communicate what vision you and the director have. What are you trying to create? And, usually when you're working on something and, something doesn't feel quite right, most of the time it's because, there is miscommunication or communication issues, So, I think if you want to be a better cinematographer, you need to learn how to communicate what you want and really articulate that. And it takes time and building relationships with your collaborators to kind of understand what you mean when you're talking to them. But if you have bad communication, you can have the best crew in the world or whatever, or you can have the best crew, but if you can't communicate what they want, you're never going to be happy with the results. So it's that's a big part of it, but then also communicating with the other people on set. It's production designers don't get enough credit. I'll say that. They're doing 90% of the heavy lifting, not 90%, but here, I don't think production designers get the credit they deserve. So much of the image and what you're seeing on screen is because of what they're building. And, it doesn't matter how great the camera work is or how great the lighting is, the world they're building and the palette and as a cinematographer communicating, the visual language of the story or whatever you're telling, it's all hand in hand. And when all those pistons are firing in sync and there's good communication, it's that's how you get the best results. And I think, usually when people are unhappy with projects, it's there's usually some type of lack of communication between different departments or different people on the crew.